To everybody, thank you for making time to join us here. I was on the way here, I was just trying to think about, a spiel on how to frame this conversation today, because it's a very complex one. It's also a very simple one if you think about it. So I work in news, and I was trying to think of, a really, really negative and bad story that is comparable to this one. So I guess a good example is I was trying to go through the three almost worst stories that we've had to cover in Bloomberg TV in the last 6 months. One was COVID-0. There's the war in Ukraine. There's an inflation story globally still. And I'll add the fourth is the banking crisis. And I was reflecting on all four. And while they may seem like they're extremely large and complex in terms of magnitude,
recording in
they're
progress.
fairly simple and straightforward, relatively speaking, to address and solve. So COVID-0 in China, for example, was one decision. They lifted all restrictions and we're here. The inflation story, we have central bankers, of course, who are on top of this. Of course, Governor Medalla, of course, has a lot to say about the topic, which we can save for another time, by the way. There's the war in Ukraine, which is obviously still ongoing. But really, if you think about it, the decision for that to disappear really comes down to a handful of people. Recently, the banking crisis globally, the regional banks in the US, and then you had the Credit Suisse saga of them eventually being purchased by UBS. Regulators basically said, here's a bunch of money, and it's largely gone away. The climate problem and the climate conversation is multiples above in terms of complexity and scale to the worst problems we have to cover on a daily basis in news, right? And we're in the business of basically talking about bad news every day. What we do is we take a few stories and tell the audience how things basically got worse every day. And the climate conversation, it will take a lot of people to get a lot of things right at the right and appropriate amount of time over the next, for now, 30 years. Who knows how long we'll be here. It's almost priced for perfection. We need to get this perfectly right. If we don't do anything, things are already bad to begin with. So I think just to frame the problem, which is why I think we have a panel today covering different areas of the effort and help us understand within the Southeast Asian context, for anyone that lives and is from Southeast Asia, we all know things aren't as straightforward, and it takes more than a village really to get things done. So you take the biggest problem in the world and then you put it into a Southeast Asian context. And I'm skeptical because I work in news, so my panelists will probably help to pull me back from my skepticism. But that's the enormity of the task that we're dealing with today. So on that positive note, let's try and get this up and running. If you have any questions, by the way, please feel free to put them onto the app, and we'll try and get them to our panelists here. I'll start things off with Governor Felipe Medalla, of course, from the Philippine Central Bank. And I guess my first question here would be, Governor, from a public sector's perspective, a regulatory perspective, even a government perspective, what exactly is the motivation? Okay. Looking at a problem that's very complex, but you feel it every day as well.
Well, you brought up a very important point, which is incentives and why people behave the way they behave. And there are really two basic issues from the point of view of economic theory, which is you may do bad things that hurt others, but the bad thing you do is good for you. So you need a system for controlling that. On the other hand, you can be doing good things where the benefits accrue to other people. So again, society needs something to do for that. Then the second one, the first one is called externalities. The second one is there are many good things we must finance collectively because they're large. Now, as you know, in the Philippines, we have a lot of gated subdivisions or villages, and they easily solve that problem. because they meet, they agree how to share the cost. As you can see, as the number of organizations, jurisdictions that have to cooperate gets larger and larger, it gets harder and harder. Just agreeing on how the national government of the Philippines will finance the budget, the burden sharing and so on. But you can imagine how difficult it is when it's the entire world that must agree. So, so the question is, why does the Philippines care so much about this, since we are a small emitter? The answer is, if this thing doesn't get solved, we will be one of the biggest victims because of our geography and our location in the overall global climate sphere. So that's why we have decided that the Philippines must, of course, visibly play a good role. And we have a very good start because we have taken what's called a whole of government approach. For instance, it's the Secretary of Energy, who is a good friend of mine, Mr. Lotilla, said, okay, we're no longer going to allow new coal plants. Then he said, well, but where will, so this is where the finance comes in. So where will the money for the new renewable energy plants come from? And then he offered one solution, which is have an interpretation of the Constitution that says renewable energy is the resource, air or sunlight, wind or sunlight. They are not Philippine natural resources. Because if they are Philippine natural resources, there are so many restrictions on foreign investments. These resources belong to the world. Therefore, we are open to 100% foreign ownership of renewable energy. I think we may also take the same view about transportation, because these are the two biggest sources of emissions. So, so the question then is, how do we now improve the financing environment for it? That's where the central bank can play a little role. For instance, we can lighten our regulation on single borrowers limits. At the same time, we cannot, our own experience with telling the banks, lend to agriculture, lend to agri beneficiaries. Many banks just choose to pay the penalty. In other words, if the economic incentives are there, it's very hard to do it. So fortunately, I think the technology is improving. The cost of generating electricity by renewable is getting lower and lower. So maybe if we can only just have a system of capturing, let's say, the carbon credits. For instance, if the Japanese who invest in wind and solar electricity in the Philippines could somehow get the carbon credits there, and so on and so forth. Of course, this involves a lot of things, including measurement, disclosure. Okay, so the entire financial sector must say, okay, every large corporation must make a declaration of what it's doing, not just in relation to the safety of the money of the banks, for instance.
Right.
But they must make a declaration as well with regard to greenhouse gases. The other thing is, we keep telling banks, if you lend money and climate change affects the ability of your borrowers to pay, make sure that that is reflected in your credit risk analysis. I think that part will go very fast. Because all the banks are doing will now to use exactly the same methodology for estimating probability of default, but include climate change in it. The harder part, which has to go, of course, will be improving access to finance.
Right.
Now, we're still discussing what to do with this, but at the very least, we must agree on definitions on taxonomy. And right now, how many taxonomies there are more taxonomies than there are countries. So we have to, we must agree on how precisely the governance and the incentives will be employed. But if you cannot even agree on the definition, then you're dead on the water.
And I think that's where things like standards, for example, I think there is a global effort to standardize information disclosure. What exactly do we need to disclose? And we'll get to things like transition plans, for example. I'll bring you in just a moment. But at this point, in fact, Harry, if I could bring you in, because this really comes under what you guys do at the SGX, right? This just whole exercise of disclosures. But before you get to that, by the way, just to explain, what do you do, by the way, for the SGX, for the benefit of our audience as well?
Yeah, maybe just a little bit of a shout out for what exchanges stand for, firstly, and then specifically what Singapore Exchange does as well. Traditionally, exchanges, and they have been and they are, a place where an orderly market, a transparent market, and a trusted market comes together across the different asset classes. And that cannot be, those are the same principles that we must withhold when we talk about climate transition as well. Operating an environment like that is really at the core of what exchanges do. Now, when it comes to Singapore Exchange, we are a multi-asset exchange. Most people think of exchanges as cash equities market, so certainly we do have cash equities, which actually only accounts for 35% of our revenue base. We also are a well-known derivatives house, whether that be equities derivatives, so having risk management solutions by way of derivatives or futures. We also have that for commodities as well. Think about key commodities like iron ores. Also launched the likes of EV metal contracts like lithium and cobalt as well, and so on. Fixed income. The global statistics is that 2.5% or so of the global bond market, which accounts for about $125 trillion US dollars, is what we call labeled green social sustainability and sustainability-linked bond. In the past 12 months, 20% of all issuances on our market is green social sustainability bonds today. That's quite a significant, 1/5 of our market is green now. And then carbon markets as well. That's something that we've launched as a JV together with our partners, Temasek, Standard Chartered, and DBS. So, when we think about each of the asset classes, there are some roles that we play to facilitate the capital flow towards sustainable transition, but there are some ways where we also have to take leads as well. So I can delve a little bit more into the different types as we progress. Me personally, we set up this team called Sustainability and Sustainable Finance about 2+ years ago. I report directly to the group CEO, and now why do I mention that? I think the organizational structures differ a lot as to how one sets up sustainability functions and sustainability embedment. For our own organization, we felt that it truly was part of our strategy to embed sustainability in every single function that we do. And so the only choice we had was for that function to be reporting to the group CEO to be able to mobilize across the whole organization. Just a final point, of course, we are also a frontline regulator. What that means is we do have regulatory functions, and it's a SPV, a separate SPV with its own board of directors to look at setting of rules, including sustainability disclosure rules and corporate governance rules, among others as well. So perhaps I shall pause there.
There we go. Yuki, I'll bring you in on that, because when you and I were having a conversation to prepare for this panel, one of the things that you wanted to bring up and that you were prioritizing that took up a lot of your time was transition plans, for example. If you could talk a little bit more about transition plans. Well, for one, what are transition plans? And would that include just the banks themselves or the banking clients as well? Yuki, I'll bring you in on that.
So maybe just a little bit of introduction about GFANZ, first of all,
Sure.
the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. So we always refer to ourselves as an alliance of the alliances. So for a bank who wants to commit to net zero by 2050, they would sign up to an alliance called the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And SGX here is signed up to the Net Zero Financial Service Providers Alliance. So we have all these 7 financial sector net zero alliances, and GFANZ is the umbrella of all the 7. So put together, we have about 550 financial institutions around the world who are committed to bringing their scope 1, 2, and 3, the financed emissions, down to net zero by 2050. And together, they represent about $135 trillion of financial assets, which is about 40% of the global financial assets. So it is quite a large group of committed financial institutions that are really interested in supporting the real economy to decarbonize and achieve the 1.5 degree target that we should aim for our existence as society and as civilization. So for that, a lot of numbers have been put around as to how much money should be invested in the transition. And I think in the concept note for this session, a figure of about $210 billion a year of investment for climate adaptation and mitigation needed in this part of the world, Southeast Asia. And I've seen figures that go up to $400 billion a year needed for climate mitigation alone in the ASEAN 8 countries. So I think there's a huge number, but we know that it is in the several $100 billion per year investment that is required. Finance traditionally has been more of a follower of regulatory change, of policy change, of customers' demand, and we have been following these changes. But in the GFANZ community, the financiers want to become not the future followers, but future makers. So we have been discussing how the finance sector can play a more proactive role in achieving this real economy decarbonization together with the other stakeholders. And so what we have put out is, so Bloomberg New Energy Finance did a study last year where they have looked at what the current financing is on renewables and on the brown fossil fuel investments. And today we are currently more or less par. So for every dollar of investment that goes into fossil fuel investments, we are already, as a global community, investing another dollar in the green economy. What we need to do is to bring that to 4-to-1 ratio. So for every dollar of existing investment to the fossil fuel industry, we need to invest $4 into the green economy. That's quadrupling what is happening today, and it is not an easy task. And this is where transition planning comes in. I think Governor Felipe and Harry have mentioned about the whole institutional approach to sustainable finance, and transition planning is exactly what that does. So it's an overarching framework at the institutional level to say, what does our target look like? How do we actually bring the finances that would achieve our target? What is the governance? What is the product development? What is the client engagement? What is the people's building that we need to do? Reskilling of our workforce. So the transition plan has 10 different components of different things that financial institutions need to do and put in place and align themselves to their targets to achieve that net zero goal by 2050. So 4-to-1 is, I think we have already seen our members, some of them have like already started to put targets around this 4:1 ratio, saying
Right.
what can we actually do from now until 2030, and what can we do further into 2050, and there are
What sort of targets, I'm curious?
yeah, so there are actually kind of more broader targets about, what is our financed emission going to be look like in 2030. So that's like a very broad, high-level headline saying we will reduce our financed emissions by, say, 40% by 2030. That's a high-level one. But we also noticed that financiers have started to look deeper. When they've started to do transition planning, they have started to look deeper to say, where is it that my clients currently are, or my investee companies are? And to be able to say, am I going to be able to invest more in green solutions? Am I going to be able to invest in more companies that are already in the green sectors? Or am I going to be able to help those that are currently in the brown economy go green? And then the hardest one is, how can I help the high-emitting assets to retire early? So accelerated managed phase-out is the word that we use about, retiring, for example, coal power plants by 2040 to get to the net zero. And I think each financial institution and where they are and where their operations are means that the 4:1 ratio could look, that where they need to finance could look different. In Southeast Asia, I think the transition finance, as it's often called, where we are supporting the brown economy to go green and to accelerate the early retirement of high-emitting assets, is the big kind of important, critical one for this region. And I think it's critical for the global economy as well, because if we don't succeed here, I don't think we will be able to achieve
and
that.
I guess before I bring Ramesh in, so retiring coal-powered plants, is that the biggest, lowest hanging fruit, that if we get that right by 2040, how much of the way do we get as far as the objective is concerned here? Because that seems like a simple problem, but it's really not.
I think it's actually a really difficult problem, and at the moment, there's only been a few successful cases. ADB has been doing the ETM, the Energy Transition Mechanism. GFANS has been involved in a new initiative called the JETPs, the Just Energy Transition Partnership, in Indonesia and in Vietnam. And in the world, we only actually have a handful of real, successful transactions on managed phase-out. So at the moment, GFANS in Asia Pacific has just launched a work stream that is developing guidance for financial institutions about what is managed phase-out for coal power plants in Asia Pacific, and how can financial institutions be involved in that. I can talk about that later.
Sure. That's a perfect segue, of course, to bring Ramesh in. Just give us a sense, really, of how the ADB has been involved recently. What are you guys busy with?
I'm happy to be seated between the two colleagues here because they have the money, and our job as a multilateral institution is to leverage the resources. Of course, we have our own capital, but the numbers that we are talking are huge. And what you outlined at the beginning, it's so hard even to frame the challenge because the issues are so complex. We need not just money, but we also need innovative solutions. We need incentives, we need policies, as Governor Medalla pointed out. So what are we doing at ADB? I won't mention too many numbers. Minister Srimalyani presented the figures from ASEAN as well as global point of view. The 38% CFPP contribution that she said is a striking number in terms of just that alone. And your question is, energy or is coal retirement the only part of the equation or the game? Answer is partly yes, but there is lots of other things that we need to do. So President Asakawa mentioned the 100 billion commitment that we made institutionally. This is cumulative financing to 2030. How do we achieve that? Clearly, money is there, but bankability is an issue that we need to work on. Climate projects, particularly the harder to do climate projects, if I were to use the traffic light terminology, the amber and the red type of projects, we need to invest in them because otherwise investors are not going to come. What Sean mentioned in the morning, the growth is phenomenal in terms of what the work that Harry is doing. In terms of the 2.5 billion to 2.5 trillion figure that Sean mentioned, how do we bring it in by mitigating risks? In Southeast Asia, we have adopted an approach. We can't patent it because the 3M terminology is there out there. The first M is mainstreaming or integrating climate into anything and everything that we do. That's going to be very, very critical, not only in the traditional infrastructure type of sectors such as energy, transport, urban, but also economy-wide transformation needs to take place. So for that, policy, legal, regulatory framework is very, very critical. Right. The second M is to mobilize money, but also skills and new ideas, new technology solutions, because the technology landscape is rapidly changing. Not all developing countries are equal. There are, lower income developing countries even within ASEAN, they need assistance. So how can we mobilize that? The third M is the messaging part. I think Minister Srimalyani highlighted the transition needs to be just and it needs to be affordable. There are significant labor dimensions in a report that we will be launching a bit later, the Global Value Chain report. It talks about broadly economy-wide labor implications for climate change would be very, very significant. I mentioned I won't talk about numbers too much, but I do want to, the 1 to 4 ratio that Yuki mentioned, that's very important to keep in mind. At the same time, what is also clear as the study that we have done shows, if the countries were to achieve the NDC, the commitments that they have come up with, or the enhanced commitment that Minister Srimalyani was talking about, the benefits, for instance, if we are shifting the goalpost to 2030, the benefits would be huge. It's $250 billion plus per year. Clearly the benefit stream is there. In a way, the proof of concept is there. But the challenge is how do we bring bankability to these projects? How do we bring investors into them? Which is what we are working on, David. ETM, we've heard many times references. Right. Bank-wide, we are also working on a facility called IFCAP, that is Innovative Finance for Climate Action in Asia and the Pacific. That is basically to free up our headroom, in the broader context of G20 capital adequacy framework. How can IFIs like ADB free up our headroom, generate more capital to support climate investment projects? In the region, in ASEAN, we've been working with Temasek Holdings of Singapore and HSBC, focused initially on Indonesia and Vietnam for an initiative called Asset Regeneration. It's a company established called Pentagreen Capital. There we are working in terms of identifying projects and bringing in investments. And of course, we have the homegrown, ASEAN-grown ASEAN Infrastructure Fund and the ACGF. And in order to take it forward, we have a Green Finance Hub as well as a Blue Finance Hub. By the way, the Blue Finance Hub is based in Indonesia to leverage significant resources. I can provide more details later. Thank you.
Governor, let me bring you back in because Ramesh brought up the very important role that banks should be playing in this. And I can't help but wonder, do we leave it up to the banks to make the decisions themselves? Because we all know that hasn't worked out quite well a few episodes in the past. What I'm trying to get to here is the decision on credit risk, for example. Do we need to rethink the role banks play, how they're regulated, how their profits are measured, how their loan books, for example, are measured as far as the risk is concerned? Right. How do you see your role as a banking regulator evolving here?
Clearly, since it's their own capital that are at risk, clearly the bank must will not want to lend to something that will lose money. So clearly the economics, you cannot fix the finance if you cannot finance the economics. So it has to come together. And for instance, One way to discourage the use of coal is to have an excise tax on coal. We already have excise taxes on cigarettes. Well, that was relatively popular. People thought that smoking should be discouraged. Of course, in this particular case, the fall in consumption was small relative to the rise in the tax. So actually, the government also gained. So that is the kind of situation that you will be looking for. Of course, everybody, there are a lot more non-smokers than smokers, so the political support for it was high. So, but it's hard to find a situation like that where the government's happy, its revenues are up, the Department of Health is happy, fewer smokers, and maybe even the spouses of the smoker is happy. The husband or the wife will live longer. Okay, so now finding a way to do that. In the case of coal, of course, if you say, let's have an excise tax on coal, that will make people maybe, if there are alternative sources of energy, that will make people, of course, retire the coal plant sooner. Of course, the problem there is if you put an excess tax on coal and alternative source of energy are not available, that means that the coal people can easily pass that on to electricity consumers, and you'll have a lot of very unhappy people. So I think, so this is where you have to come in and say, make sure that as you discourage coal, the cleaner source of power are coming in. And that's maybe where the finance will come in. And thankfully, the technology is also getting better and better in favor of renewables. So it has to be a combination. And then this is where we can say maybe we will be allowing, because in the case of the central bank, if you're too exposed to a single borrower, that's considered unwise. Because at least if you have thousands of borrowers, you can use the law of large numbers to say, okay, if only 3% of them default, I'm all right. But then you have a very large borrower that goes under, there goes your calculations.
Right.
So we might, in the past, we have lifted the single borrowers limits for projects that are good for the country. In other words, the banks are a little bit less safe because they're more exposed to single borrower failure could cause problems. At the same time, the country benefits as a whole. These are the things you have to weigh. So, so the easiest part is look at all the regulations on lending and see the extent that they can be relaxed in favor of moving towards net zero. Fully realizing, though, that you are also creating new risks. Okay, so if you have a bank that has, so one solution is the banks are allowed to sort of split the loans. But then you probably need the lead bank to be the main bank. This is really their work. They're always a lead bank because the guy that works the hardest to get the loan, of course, should be rewarded more. So these are the things we have to look at, the extent to which this kind of lending can be further, the obstacle to such kind of lending could be further reduced. But at the same time, I said the basic economics has to be right. The dirtier sources should be the more expensive sources. And the cleaner sources should be the cheaper sources. Now, whether the government is willing to say, it's one thing to say, I'll tax coal. It's another thing to say, I'll subsidize wind.
Right.
Because then, remember, the government also does not have enough money for education, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. But if at the very least, by the way, in the case of gasoline and diesel, the Philippines is already the most advanced because we are the ones that tax diesel and gasoline the most. So extending the concept to coal should of course, the motorists would rather have a lower tax, but somehow they have adjusted to the tax. Okay, so I think the fiscal authorities and the monetary authorities working together. But also, it's extremely important to realize that the public must support it. And in the Philippines, surveys show the public support it because they do realize that the Philippines is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world. And then it doesn't make sense that here you are telling the world, oh, pity us, but here we are doing nothing in our own backyard. So I think that's, in the case of the Philippines, that seems to be working. The level of consciousness about doing something about global warming is very high. And maybe selling a few taxes here and there, and should not be too difficult. But as I said, you have to finance the alternative. The alternative must come, and then I think the position taken by the government, 100% foreign ownership of the renewable energies is not against the Constitution, and should therefore be, because of the great importance to us of reducing, moving towards net zero, justifies even giving them incentives. Now, if the foreign investor in greenhouse, in wind, solar, can somehow get the carbon credits in his home country, then that works very well, because then the power will be cheaper. The cleaner power will be cheaper because of that, the carbon credits, and the dirtier power is being taxed. Then the financial incentives,
are
the financial incentives are correctly aligned. And then the job of the banker becomes easier. Okay?
Well, banks will be banks then, basically.
Yeah, banks will be banks. But
banks will be banks.
Yeah, banks will be banks. They will move in that direction.
Okay.
So my point is that this is a whole of government, whole of society approach. The public understands the problem and supports the fact that some of the solutions will be painful to some of us. And people are willing to do that for a good cause. But in addition, of course, the economics has to be right. Like it or not, people will buy what's cheaper, because in the end, 1 kilowatt of power is 1 kilowatt of power, 1 kilowatt hour power, and you do not know, the refrigerator does not distinguish between the source.
Right, yeah. It doesn't shut off.
If you have a refrigerator that works better when
Well, who knows?
solar.
Who knows? We could ask Elon Musk to come up with
Yeah.
something. Harry, I'll bring you in, because the role of capital markets, we talk about banking and multilaterals, for example. What's the popularity like of sustainability-like instruments? Because I would imagine on the capital structure, that's a little bit more expensive from an issuer perspective. So I'm wondering what the incentives are for corporates themselves to raise money through these instruments.
You know what capital markets represent is scale. I mentioned numbers for the bond markets, 125 trillion plus. Equity capital markets globally is also 120 trillion plus. It may have gone down a little bit since this is a 2021 statistics. So when you talk about scale, you can't leave capital markets out. Before going into the corporates incentives, perhaps I can just mention 3 leverage points. Because at the end of the day, corporates come where there will be funding. Capital markets exist because companies want to raise funding. Leverage point number 1 would be, if you consider, if you'd like, the setup of financial markets. At the apex of that are what's called asset owners. Those are the ones, the likes of pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies that manage the premium that they collected from you and I. And, you know, once you have the asset owners facing the right direction, because they're at the apex of the food chain, if you'd like, everyone else, whether that be asset managers, banks, service providers, you know, credit rating agencies, exchanges, everyone will sort of align. So asset owners is a critical point. Second one would be, in some ways, the financial institutions world have been moving, in some ways, faster than the real economy. What do I mean by that? Financial institutions, by definition, they finance what the real economy is doing, and therefore they're indirect components of the economy, right? And so whilst I've seen so many financial institutions who want to have significant commitment, including in the emerging markets, but if there's a gap between the real economy and the financing world, again, there'll be a stop. So then the third component, which is why all of us in the room together, is, of course, the aspects of how do we mix and match capital to better mitigate certain risks that's arising in what we need to do net zero, to achieve net zero. Let me just go back. So in terms of thinking about how do we align the money so that the corporates understand that financial institutions really are there to fund the transition that they need to make, because that's the ultimate incentive. Yuki, I'm sure, can share a little bit more about what is a credible transition plan from a financial institution as an institution perspective. I'll just give an example from instrument perspective in mobilizing capital. 42% of the managed equity assets globally is actually what's called passive investing, although when it comes to climate side or sustainability side, it's not so passive, in a sense that there's a lot of engagement and stewardship that's going on to engage with the underlying invested companies on this topic. But what's important is that, again, starting at the asset owner level, there's been certain principles that were recently launched at the end of the year to state what is a credible index, because passive investing, that 42% of the equity managed assets, follow indices, right? The likes of S&P, MSCI, etc. So there are certain principles of what Paris-aligned indices and funds that launch thereof, what are important. Some of the key points were ensuring transparency. It's often very easy when you think about Paris aligned to only think about who's aligned today. Let's only include the parts of the economy who are already green, who are already aligned. But actually there was a great call from these asset owners to say, actually it's not enough to only support who's already green today. We have to support the transition in the geographies, in the sectors that are hard to abate. Therefore, there should be no mechanical exclusion from these indices. It also has to correspond to real economy impact, which means, again, then you have to link it back to what the real economy is doing. And then you have to account. No one quite knows how. We are all doing little bits of our work, but how do you account for the different speeds of decarbonization? We just heard that Indonesia is gearing towards 2060 or sooner. Some are going for 2040. Ultimately, we're trying to reach 2050. But how do we account for this in the instruments? Forward-looking indicators, how do we embed science-based targets into these methodologies, and how do we actually account for this with transparency? So these are some of the ways of thinking through how to embed best practices into instruments that are scaling at great scale. I'll very, very quickly touch upon the two points that I mentioned. The real economy and the financial institutions mix. This is where exchanges can play a very critical role. We are an interchange between the two. We engage non-stop all day, every day with the corporates as well as the financial world. So if we need a neutral platform to bring everyone together and make it happen as a system, this is a very, very critical role that we play and we continue to play. Thirdly, on blended finance, unfortunately, there's many mechanisms out there, very, very little that happens in the capital markets, and it's also because it's hard. Those who are providing the blended finance solutions or the funding for that want to see specific projects as an outcome. By definition, some of the capital markets is a bit fungible in the money that gets used because it's corporate purposes raising. And so there are certain schemes that we've worked with our ecosystem make these work, but We just need a lot more of it, so we welcome more partnerships with the likes of ADB and other philanthropies as well.
Yuki, I'll bring you in here because we need a tangible example of where we hopefully can see the most progress in Southeast Asia. I'm going to bring it back to coal because that's really what you were bringing up during our conversation last week. Well, for one, retiring a coal plant takes significant capital expenditure up front, and you give up the earnings on the back end. So I think to Harry's point, people want to understand that financial institutions are there to fund that transition or that gap, for example. Could you give us just a brief example of a success story that we've seen so far, this part of the world in Southeast Asia, and also coal plants in Southeast Asia are relatively young, so the cost is much higher up front right now.
Yeah. So let me first of all just explain what we are currently doing at the moment on our work, which is the work stream on the managed phase out of coal power plants in Asia. So as you say, it's extremely young. The average age of power plants in Southeast Asia is 11 years old. In Asia, generally, it's about 13 years old. And in Europe, it's 23 years old. US, it's 33 years old. So those like US and Europe, they're nearly retiring. And they can replace that with renewable energy. But for Asia's coal power plants, if we let it live the rest, the 4 years of their useful life, which is about 40 to 45 years, then I don't think the whole world economy, we will not achieve a 1.5 degree target. We'll miss it. So I think it's in the interest of not only this region, but the whole global economy to support the early or accelerated retirement of coal power plants in Asia.
Can I add to that, David? Even if you don't retire them, but remember, economic growth in the ASEAN is fast. So at least the new power should be cleaner. So because if you have, that's the advantage of having an economy that's growing. The new things, hopefully, will be much cleaner than the old things. So although the dirty part has not gone down, it has gone down in relation to the economy. And then, of course, in 20 more years, the problem gone. And if you have an excise tax on coal, that period, the higher the excise tax, the sooner the retirement will happen. Of course, the early investors will be quite unhappy because when they put their money into the coal plants, they were not told this was going to happen. But you can always tell them, well, and you invest. Part of the uncertainty is policies may change, and nobody guaranteed that to you that coal will not be taxed. So that's your own lookout. So, okay. So those combination of policies that discourage new dirty activities and encouraging early retirement of fixed capital that are used in there. But as you can see, these taxes will hurt some people. The power may go up, the price. So, but I think maybe I'm too idealistic. The more people understand the problem, the more they were willing to make sacrifices to make it happen. So this is where the role of communication and education has to come in. That we're all in this together. It's like we don't like to like the character Pogo says, I have met the enemy and he is us. So we want to have that realization that many important things require collective action and consensus. And I think this is where political leadership, the media, education has to come in.
I agree with the governor that social acceptance, communication, is really important in the managed phase out of coal. In South Africa, the managed phase out of coal is a big issue right now, and it's been over-politicized, but there it is about jobs. there's a lot of people in the coal mining and coal power plants, and they are at risk because their plants are actually older, so their accelerated managed phase out is more like in a few years' time, rather than in Asia, which could be in the next 10 years or more. In Asia, I think the biggest social consideration when we think about just transition is about affordability and accessibility. So making sure that of course, reskilling of jobs and communities can happen, but I think we're talking about a longer time to prepare that. What is more of a consideration is making sure that we are balancing the accelerated retirement with new energy that is coming along, what the governor was saying. And in some countries, so each of the countries' current energy situation is different, even in Asia, Southeast Asia. And some have more of an issue of needing to retire current electricity supplies before you can bring in renewables. And then those that are growing so fast that you need renewables to catch up, making sure that catches up with the growing energy demand. So I think it's a different story for each of the countries, even in the ASEAN region. But what we're looking at in our work stream is to balance three things. One is, how can we make sure that it is a credible managed phase out? Because lack of credibility of managed phase out can kill a transaction. Because financial institutions, especially those that are committed to net zero, are not going to touch things that they would be, branded as greenwashing or not honoring their commitments. So credibility that it is really supporting the real economy decarbonization is really important. The other one is financial viability, like you were saying earlier. Because they are young, they have a lot of financial value attached to it. How can you use different levers to make sure that it is a financial viable deal for the asset owner and the financiers involved? And that would require financial engineering. So a lot of innovation is being currently thought about how to structure a deal that is financially viable. The other one is blended finance, where, what is the role of an ADB or a G7 country in this matter? And it can be like, the things that we hear most are three things. One is to improve the risk return. But then there are other things as well, like the technical assistance of project preparation is very costly and very high risk commercially. So they would love the ADB to support that, or a philanthropic capital to do that. The other one is for the governments and public finance to take care of the just transition costs, because so like reskilling of the workforce, or making sure that it is the affordability is there. So doing that kind of cost that is related to just transition is actually a cost on its own, on top of the managed phase out of the cost of retiring. Yeah. So those are probably the three big things that a lot of financiers are looking for from the concessionary finance. So it could be from governments, but it can also be from philanthropic capital as well. And the last one was the just transition. So a lot of concern that if financiers are involved in this transaction, they want to know what is their responsibility and what is the just transition that is involved in this deal, and to make sure that they are able to work with the best stakeholders, with the government, with the asset owners around the just transition. So three things.
Ramesh, I guess very quickly, we've almost run out of time. Amazing how time flies. The next, 10 years is a long time, let alone 30. Let's look at the next 2-3 years. What do you think are lofty enough but achievable targets in terms of what the priorities should be, for example, for a multilateral like the ADB, for example? What role can and should you play these next 2-3 years? And apart, Indonesia, for example, let's just take this as an example.
Before that, just a couple of points, David, just reflecting on what the governor and Harry and Yuki have said. Alignment of incentives is going to be very, very critical. I think the point that the governor made, and how do we bring, for example, the balance between real and financial sector, that also is going to be critical. Clearly, private sector will always be moving faster than the real sector, and particularly between private and public sector, you have that balance always. Now, on the coal plants, you asked the question, how do we deal with the challenge of young plants, right? If the average age is 11, obviously for people, for labor, being young is a demographic dividend, but here it's a demographic curse for the coal plants. We are looking at three things, basically. It's cost, security, and equity. So, for instance, can you take a 15-year plant, and if the shareholders, the investors, what will be the cost that they will incur in retiring it, say, in 20 years' time, as opposed to the plant staying on for 40 years? That is exactly what we are going through right now. And taking that forward to the question that you raised, what should we be looking for? What should we collectively, not just ADB, but the multilateral institutions, private sector, as well as the public sector, if in the next 3 years, I would say by 2025, in ASEAN, to start with, in the 2 countries plus Philippines, because the ETM was launched for the 3 countries, if we create a portfolio of CFPPs, right now, we have identified a number, but the first step has been taken with regard to the plant in West Java that Minister Srimulyani mentioned, the Cirebon plant. We need a portfolio, a diversified portfolio of coal assets that we can identify, and money going in, a combination of public, private, as well as philanthropic contributions going in, is very, very critical. Now, the governor's point is also, okay, retiring coal plants is one, but you also need a very strong binding policy commitment that no more new coal. That is very important. Of course, it's going to be a challenge for some. In fact, the costs of the 1-to-4 ratio that Yuki mentioned, if you just apply it to having advanced technologies brought in for new coal, it's not worth it. It's not worth the challenge. And I want to, since Sean is back in the room, I want to put a plug to what he said. In terms of looking at urban resilience is going to be very, very critical. And the cost and the challenges that ASEAN is facing, particularly from natural disasters, lack of resilience, we need to invest. That also, I would say, we need innovative solutions brought out in the next 3 years, because you put a 3-year time frame. I would put those 2, but a lot of other things need to be happening in parallel.
Final thoughts. I'll take the liberty of taking a few minutes here. Harry, I was having a conversation with one of your peers, the Hong Kong Exchange, I think it was 1 or 2 years ago. And one of the things that they're exploring, not that there's any roadmap to that, is if a certain corporate would not have a transition plan or a disclosure blueprint, for example, then you can't raise money here. Are we ready to have that conversation, say, in Singapore?
If you're an exchange that's committed to NZFSPA that Yuki mentioned, which both Hong Kong Exchange and SGX are, what it means is you've committed long-term as an exchange to 2050, that by 2050, your services as an exchange would be aligned to net zero. Now, what that means is eventually, by 2050, to support that, the exchanges should play their part. It will go down to timing as well. Okay. For example, if we actually just cut off the capital market mechanism for the companies that need to transition in hard-to-abate sectors completely, they'll just go elsewhere. They'll just go private, where there's a lot less transparency, a lot less, in some ways, pockets of capital, because many of the asset owners actually allocate capital to capital markets before that transparency and the trust and so on. So how do we actually then work with the ecosystem such that there are some guardrails around over time? How do you look at companies that are hard to abate, that want to tap into the capital markets, whether that's equity or debt, and then how do you actually help provide further transparency for one, whether that be your current status or the future looking, which is the transition plan that you mentioned of.
Yeah, okay. Just making sure. Thank you so much to our panelists here. A round of applause, please. And thank you so much for joining us today.